This is lecture 10. We're going to be talking about sources of genetic variation, and one of the things that we're going to take a look at is this relatively new field, which is called epigenetics. So again, we're going to be talking more about these different sources of genetic variation and try to understand a little bit more about the way in which genes may be influencing behavior. So, what is epigenetics? I think the best way to describe it is that there's a third component. We talk about genes, we talk about the environment, but there's this third component now in which we know that there's some chemical reactions that are not really tied to nature and they're not really tied to nurture. That may be accounting for variation in behavior. So what we're really talking about here in the case of this third component, this thing called epigenetics, is that it's determining how each gene is either being strengthened or it's being weakened. So you really have to consider this as being like a DNA being like a keyboard, a giant keyboard. And our genes are the keys, and those keys can be struck either very softly or very hard. And that indeed is going to determine the degree to which that particular gene is going to be exerting an influence. So the epigenetic process really determines when and how each one of those genes are struck, and it can change the tune that's being played. So again, think of it as DNA being this giant keyboard, and think of your genes as being the keys on that DNA keyboard. So nature puts some things in pencil. Again, that can be erased, that can be changed. We call that epigenetics. And it puts other things in pen. And of course, with a pen, when you use a pen, the ink is not something that you can change. Once you put down something in pen, it is not something that can be altered. So consider the genome as being the hardware. Consider the epigenome to be the software. So I want to try to give you an example of what we're talking about here. And to help you to understand a little bit better about what we mean by epigenetics. When we study inheritance, when we study gene expression, there are things other than changes in the underlying DNA sequence that apparently may be important. So take our identical twins that you have here. They start out the same in terms of their underlying genetic background. That DNA, however, can be exerting different kinds of influences later on, depending upon stress, depending upon nutrition. It can cause individual genes to behave in different ways. We call these tags, epigenetic tags. They're chemical mechanisms. And again, consider our DNA keyboard now. Those genes can be struck very soft or they can be struck very hard. And we're not talking about DNA changing. What we're talking about is the expression of individual genes. And again, it's thought that there's a chemical mechanism that's involved with this, that's activating or suppressing those genes in different ways, in different degrees. But again, DNA doesn't change. And scientists are now coming to believe that a good portion of this may be something that is inherited. So take a look at the development of these identical twins. And what you see is a divergence that occurs over time based upon the presence or absence of these tags. Again, we don't really know precisely what the tagging is all about. We don't know whether or not, it could be an environmental influence, could be, the impact, for example, of stress. It could be the impact of the kinds of food that you eat. But these shifts can happen really without any outside influences. Random epigenetic shifts can occur. So this is a very interesting way of looking at what our behavior is a product of. We have this third component. We have genes, we have environment, and now we have this epigenetic influence in which these tags, these chemical mechanisms can actually activate, or they can suppress genes to different degrees. So here's an example of an epigenetic effect in animals. Here you can see a mother rat that's licking her offspring. And typically they do this in order to stimulate the growth of various muscles, for example, that are involved in urinating and in defecating. Rat moms can be classified as either being mothers who lick and groom their offspring a lot. We call them high lick and groom mothers, or they can be classified as low lick and groom mothers. That is, they still stimulate their offspring, but they don't stimulate their offspring anywhere near as much. So again, we have this variation that occurs in terms of the degree to which the mother is spending time with her offspring, licking them and caring for them. Well, here's what scientists have found. What they found is that in mothers that are low lick and groom mothers, that is, they're not spending as much time licking and grooming their offspring as high lick and groom mothers. What we find is that in these high lick and groom mothers, the offspring tend to be healthier, they grow at a faster rate, and they seem to be better overall. In terms of various reproductive characteristics, as well as how long they live. So this is indeed a very interesting finding, because one of the things that we know is licking and grooming can do a lot of different things to the development of the offspring in terms of the brain of the offspring during these early critical periods of brain development. They can promote the hypothalamus to release this hormone that's called CRF. We're going to hear about CRF when we get to the whole area of learning and memory. It then stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete another important hormone, which is called ACTH. And that promotes the adrenal glands to secrete what are called glucocorticoids. All these things can have very pronounced effects in terms of the development of the offspring. So again, this is an example of an epigenetic effect. Now, one of the things that we know is that you can be impacted in a variety of different ways, sometimes often in subtle ways. That are going to change your behavior. A subtle kind of environmental effect can change your behavior. What you see there in that picture is called an elevated plus maze. And there's a rat that's in the maze, and you can see that this side that you see right here is enclosed. Okay, and this side that you see here is also enclosed. But this is open, and this is open over here. So again, here's the plus, again, elevated plus maze, and this has these sides on it, and this has no sides. Well, this has been a way of really distinguishing between animals that are high anxiety versus those that are low anxiety. And in the case of a high anxiety animal, they will tend to spend most of the time in these enclosed areas. A low anxiety animal, on the other hand, will tend to spend much more time in these open areas that you see here. So we have, scientists then have bred animals for high or low anxiety, mice in particular. And one of the things that we know is that we can change that genetic potential by some very subtle kinds of environmental effects. For example, one of the things that we can do is we can alter these genetic predispositions by, for example, the amount of time that you handle an animal. If you handle a high anxiety animal a lot, chances are that it's going to become low anxiety. Again, subtle kinds of differences in the environment, like odors, for example, as well, can change that underlying genetic potential. Now, when we talk about sources of error in our studies of the genetics of behavior, sometimes what we think is an underlying genetic influence, hereditary influence, really isn't. And we have to really be very careful in terms of making conclusions about what we think is a genetic influence when in fact it really is not. For example, there's a good deal that can occur during prenatal life. Mother exposed to alcohol, for example, or exposed to poor diet, or maybe exposed to poor medical care, and then, something happens to the offspring. Maybe developmental lags that can occur, behavioral differences that can occur. Some of us, might conclude that that's a genetic effect, but if you go back and you take a look at, what the mother was exposed to, and hence what the developing fetus was exposed to in terms of the environment, maybe it's instead of a genetic influence, it's something that's related to the environment, like exposure to alcohol, or exposure to a drug, or exposure to diets that are not conducive to the development of the offspring. So again, you have to be very, very careful about concluding whether or not a particular behavioral outcome is in fact a genetic related outcome. So lots of different sources of error in terms of the genetics of behavior. Environmental factors we know can actually inactivate genes. Malnutrition, for example, can inactivate certain types of genes. Here's another important source of error in terms of the genetics of behavior, one that I think is often overlooked. But it's something that's called multiplier effects. And I think one of the great examples of this is in the case of athletics, where, for example, you have a young child who is very interested in playing basketball, seems to be relatively good at it at a relatively early age, and the parents now start to give that child all kinds of special training and coaching and attention. And what happens? Well, that child ultimately becomes a pretty good basketball player. But it's not necessarily the fact that this was something that this child was predisposed to genetically. Maybe there was an initial push by genetics, but you can magnify that a great deal by simply changing the environment in some important ways. You can magnify that original tendency to be good at the game of basketball by exposing the child to all these kinds of environmental enrichments. So there are traits with very strong hereditary influences that can be modified by the environment. Take a look at that elevated plasmase that we talked about. Take a look at the genetic condition, for example, that we're going to talk about, which is called PKU. You'll see an example of this. So again, this is something that we have to be constantly aware of when we're trying to attribute a genetic effect to a particular, behavioral outcome. We have to make sure that it is indeed something that is related to genes, and it's not something that's related to the environment. So again, a genetic disorder, PKU, phenylketonuria, this is a single gene defect. You can see a young girl there on the top of that picture. This is a girl that has been diagnosed with PKU. It is the absence of a gene that is producing this particular effect. These children are ones that typically show low IQ as they develop. They tend to be shorter than a non-PKU child, elevated irritability. These are all characteristics. They look perfectly normal at the time of birth, but they deteriorate. They deteriorate rapidly in terms of intelligence. Well, here's what we know about this. Phenylalanine is a protein that you find it in dairy products. And one of the things that happens in a PKU child is that because they lack this gene that allows the individual to convert phenylalanine into other proteins, that phenylalanine builds up almost in toxic concentrations in the central nervous system, and it causes retardation. But you can prevent the manifestation of this disorder by simply placing a child at a very early age on a low phenylalanine diet. So this the toxic effect then of this of the absence of this gene and the inability to convert phenylalanine simply isn't going to be allowed to express itself if the individual is put upon a low phenylalanine diet. I mean, this is really a great example of what we call a gene-environment interaction. You can short circuit the effects of a particular gene by modifying the environment. In this case, the modification of the environment is by way of diet. This question, how do genes influence behavior? Well, genes don't directly influence behavior at all. Genes, as we noted earlier, are involved in the production of new proteins. What that is going to do is either going to increase or decrease the probability that a behavior will occur under certain kinds of environmental circumstances. So genes can have indirect effects. Genes can alter your environment by changing how people react to you. Take the case of our young child that seems to be getting pretty good at basketball, and now this restructuring of the environment to give them more exposure to the game in terms of coaching and training and so on. That's a perfect example of genes really exerting their effects in a very indirect way by altering your environment. So how do genes influence behavior? Well, evolution is changing the gene pool, is changing the frequency of various genes over generations. And you see there in that picture, two types of squirrels. If one, if they begin to separate themselves, into different environments, and they do so for a long enough period of time, even though they've come from the same genetic background, they may evolve different genetic backgrounds and hence different kinds of physical and behavioral characteristics. This is not uncommon in the case of evolution. So in evolution, we're trying to answer two different questions. How do some species evolve? How do they evolve? And how did some species evolve? Those are two really different questions. And the only way in which we can try to understand this is to look at what we call evolutionary trees. And how species evolve rests really upon two assumptions. One, of course, is that offspring resemble their parents, and they do so for genetic reasons. We talked about recombination. That's the primary way of the passing on of genes and the creation of different genetic backgrounds through that shuffling process, that recombination process that occurs during meiosis. And of course, mutations that can occur. I mean, those are the two primary ways that we have. And again, in the case of recombinations that occur, you're having new variations, and that may in fact help survival and reproduction. It may not work to help survival and reproduction depending upon the environment that the organism is in. So when you take a look at these evolutionary trees, like you see here, these are tentative. Here in the case of relationships among mammals, birds, and reptiles, for example, this is what these relationships look like, okay, at present time, okay. Evolutionary relationships, now take a look at this in terms of mammals, right? This is what we see, but this may change, okay? And indeed, it may change based upon natural selection, based upon what is happening in terms of the environment, what is happening in terms of the gene pools that are in the environment. This is, you know, something that is clearly tentative. So again, very interesting work in the case of trying to understand, you know, what our behavior is a product of in terms of genes, this whole idea of epigenetics, and then different sources of variation that we have to be constantly aware of. So in our next lecture, we're going to talk about some myths that are involved with evolution, trying to help you to understand that a little bit better.